Okay, everyone, I think we're going to get started. This is Russ Condy again with Club Benchmarking. Um, it's about 2 minutes after, and I think most of the people that are going to come on are probably already on. So we've got a pretty good sized group, and just looking at the names, it looks like we've got a nice combination of both members and non-CB members. So should be a good session for all. And right, this webinar is on capital generation KPIs. I think most folks have heard about this new executive dashboard report that we've come up with. And so this is looking at a few of the key performance indicators within that new executive dashboard. I'll talk a little bit about the dashboard in a minute and the whole concept of it, but we're going to dive into the capital aspects of it pretty quickly. This is as most of you know, we've been doing these webinars not quite every month, but pretty darn close. And we've actually built up a very nice archive of these little 30, 40-minute webinars. They're all very content focused. And so, just realized I wasn't sharing my screen. So there we go. So they're very content focused. And I just wanted to draw everyone's attention. They're great when you come on these webinars and you listen to them live, but they're always available on archive as well, whether you want to watch them, whether you want to push them to someone else on the club staff or to a board member or something like that. So these videos are always available on clubbenchmarking.com website. If you just go under resources to video library, you'll see all of these over on the left-hand side, and they're very topical. I mean, here's one we did in the start of this series on the executive dashboard, but food and beverage dues, board orientation, course maintenance, budgeting, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of great little half-hour videos on here. So I encourage you to take advantage of those. And if you didn't participate in them live, to go and take a look at those. I always start with a little bit of an overview as we go into the topic because, it's good to just sort of frame everything with some of the challenges that the industry faces. And the challenges really are rooted in a pretty common set of attributes, if you will. This is a big industry. It's a $20 billion industry. But there's a unique aspect to the industry, which is it's extremely fractured. They're depending on how you count the numbers. There are, let's say 4,000, 4,500 private clubs that make up that $20 billion industry. That's a lot of companies, if you will, to make up a single $20 billion industry. The largest club is in the order of $95 to $100 million, is a massive club. But that's unusual. In a $20 billion industry, usually you have 3 or 4 players that are, $1 billion to $2 billion in revenue and a bunch of 500 million and then a bunch of little ones. This whole industry is made up of lots of little players. So it's very fractured. The board dynamics, as we know, are challenging, and that's one of the reasons we're talking about capital today, because frankly, it doesn't get enough discussion in the boardroom, and it's one of the reasons why we have that as part of the overall executive dashboard report. So it's this constant churn of governors. You've got every 3 years, you've got an entire new set, 30 or 40,000 people that are now in charge of governance of this industry. That's a crazy model, but it's the model we have. So if we can't have the model we want, we have to figure out how do we work in the model we have, and that's part of what we attack with information and data. And we've seen it. It's very effective when you bring in information, and it's not to pound the table, but it's to educate the board and educate staff at the same time. It really has a profound effect. And so this is all about standardized measures and us introducing these standardized measures, and we're going to talk about 3 standardized measures specifically. Not only can it have a significant impact on governance, but it actually puts predictability into your club financial model. So it's not we have to go through the year to see how we did, but we can get ahead of that curve a little bit, just like regular companies get ahead of the curve and try to predict gross margins and gross profits and things like that. We can do the same thing in this industry. There's no reason we can't. So what we're going to look at today, basically our goals are to look at a few of the standardized measures in assessing capital generation. Some of those come directly from the executive dashboard report, but they still hold water whether you're a subscriber or not, so they're important to understand. And this, when you get to capital, it's a little different than operating and thinking about operating finances. Capital is really what keeps the club relevant. I think that's an important word to use in this industry, is relevancy. How do you keep your club relevant to the prospective members and to the community around you? And it really takes investment to do that, because the things that made the club relevant 50 years ago are not the same things that make it relevant today. And generally those things take money to keep on that relevancy curve. So in my view, you're either investing in the club and maintaining relevancy, or your club is starving and you're really falling behind because you can't invest in the things you need to for the new members that are coming along. And so ultimately it's about being proactive around this stuff, not reactive. And as I mentioned, standardized measures fostering predictability. So those are the kind of the goals for today, to discuss some of those items. We're going to start with just a little bit of very, very quickly. I'm sure everybody gets, the difference between operating and capital, but we're going to take about 1 minute and go through that. We're strong believers that all clubs, whether you're a $50 million club or a $2 million club, you should separate and have a wall between your operating funds and your capital funds. And that separation should be where the money comes from and where it goes, both from operations and capital. When clubs bleed those two together, they tend to get into trouble because they don't really understand, are we funding operations completely via operational revenues? Are we stealing capital to patch that up? All those kind of things become blurred when you commingle the money. And so not commingling that money, we think is a very wise idea. But obviously, operating is kind of the blood flow of the club. It's the people you see walking around. It's the things you do every day in the club. As a member enjoying the club, and the capital tends to go around the infrastructure or the skeleton of the club. Building fitness centers, building a new outdoor dining area, or it might just be maintenance capital, getting a new HVAC piece of equipment, things like that. But it is important to train your membership with respect to capital specifically. It is important to train your membership to know the difference, and to train them that they have to fund those two different things forever. Their obligation to funding capital in the club does not end by paying their initiation fee. It's an ongoing obligation, just like paying their operating dues is an obligation. So we'll talk about that a little bit in terms of capital dues and things like that. Just very quickly, obviously, we all understand the sources of operating funds, the sources of capital funds. That's pretty clear. The thing that isn't always as clear and is a pitfall of the industry is, when you're operating, when you produce operating deficits, you tend to steal out of your capital funds, which tends to bring you into a capital starvation mode in terms of investing and maintaining relevancy of the club. I don't want to spend too much time on that because I do want to try to keep this to that 35 minute time frame. But, obviously capital starvation, it is a major problem in the industry. It's not as major as it was 3 or 4 years ago. I mean, we get to see all the data, and it's pretty clear that the industry has, well, not 100%, has come back to a more healthy state than it was 3 years ago, especially for larger clubs. Smaller clubs tend to be the ones that are still struggling a little bit more. They're a little bit slower to come back, I think, just because they have maybe a little bit. There's a lot of attributes that actually cause that, but the reality is they still tend to be more often running operational deficits, and which helps put them in a capital starvation mode. Obviously, being capitally starved comes from either patching up or an operating deficit. You're stealing those capital monies, or fundamentally a lack of capital income, and that's pretty easy to fall into the latter here. When you rely solely on initiation fees for your capital income, it's very easy to get into that capital starvation mode, because obviously initiation fees are often unpredictable. If you happen to be a very sought after club that's got a long waiting list and a predictable turnover, it can be somewhat predictable source to have initiation fees as your main source of capital. But if it's not predictable, 1 year you bring on 10 members, 1 year you bring on 2, 1 year you bring on 20. That's a very lumpy scenario, and that lack of capital income or lack of predictability is a problem. So you need to understand your needs and map your capital income to your capital needs. Just very quickly, on the dashboard, I mentioned it a little bit, but the whole idea behind this concept of the executive's dashboard And again, we're just looking at one slice of it today. We had an earlier webinar which looked at the overarching view, so you might want to watch that video if you haven't participated in that, and there'll be more following on. But the bottom line, it's getting away from, the cult of personality and some of the, frankly, ineffective discussions that happen in the boardroom. Focus on cost of food, things like that. Getting them up to the higher level, just like they would in any business. And frankly, it's really all about putting predictability into the performance of the club. I am a true firm believer that if a board focused on the 15 KPIs that are in the executive dashboard report, that's the only thing they need to look at financially, unless there's a real issue. That deep diving into department level and sub-department level finances is generally a waste of time for boards. If you're watching the big picture and you're setting the right targets, let your staff manage to that. You don't really need to get into that over-managed scenario. So let's get into a little bit of the numbers. So we're looking at the capital generation part of the executive dashboard. There's an operating finance part, another part we call operations. There's a part around membership, and there's a part around debt, right? So there's 15 KPIs combined that make up this executive dashboard. If you're a member and you haven't run your executive dashboard report, please go in and do that as soon as possible. There's a Word version and a PowerPoint version, and it's really the place that should get a lot of attention. So we're going to look at the capital generation piece. Specifically, when we think about a KPI, a key performance indicator, the bottom line is we're really trying to answer a specific question, right? Any KPI, any key performance indicator should have a question behind it that you're answering. And that's what we're doing with these three. Every KPI in the dashboard has a key question. And these are relatively, simple to understand, right? How much capital income did we produce? Well, the KPI we're going to look at is capital income. How much capital income capital is available after adjusting for operating loss or gain? Remember, I said if you have an operating gain, it adds to capital. If you have an operating loss, you tend to steal from capital. So it's that net number after operations and after paying lease payments or other capital flows. What is my net available capital? And then, frankly, did you produce sufficient capital? And we have a ratio. We look at that looks at the size of the club versus the amount of capital you produced. So those are the three indicators we're going to look at. The last one really being the most important, we'll probably spend the most time on. That's where the one that really is probably the most telling measure of capital power. So within the report, I'm just highlighting, this is the whole report. People that have run it are familiar with it. And this is the section we're looking at right here. Here's your operating stuff, gross margins and net bottom line. And here's payroll and F&B and membership and debt. But we're going to look right here. That's where we're focusing today. So the first KPI, and I know this is going quick. I apologize for that. But we try to cram a lot of information into a relatively short amount of time. When you're looking at capital, the first thing you should understand is how much capital income did we produce, right? Forget about, operations yet, but just how much capital income did we derive? And if you look at the industry overall, obviously there's a wide dispersion because you've got a wide dispersion of clubs. But the median club in the industry, which is about a $6.5 to $7 million club, generates this is clubs with golf. We'll look at non-golf in a second. Generally generates about $660,000 of capital income. Now we don't know that it's completely available yet because we don't know what the operational result was, a surplus or a deficit. At the 25th percentile, it's about $260,000, and then at the 75th percentile, it's a little under $1.5 million. Obviously, the absolute numbers aren't overly meaningful, but I'm just using this as a framing piece for the industry. I think it is meaningful on the executive dashboard report for a particular club or for a particular club to understand their capital income, because you want to start creating an institutional memory for the board and for the folks governing the club and for the executives to understand what's typical for us, right? Is it typical for us we generate around $1.5 million, $1 million, 600,000, whatever your number is? You want to sort of be pretty familiar with what that is on a year-over-year basis. Interestingly, for non-golf clubs, it is different. It's a little bit lower, which isn't surprising that the capital needs of a club without golf are a little bit lower. And this is dominated really by city athletic clubs, although there certainly are some yacht clubs in there. But it just gives you a little bit of perspective and maybe something maybe you didn't know before, which in general, clubs with golf, produce, what is this, roughly 20%, 20 to 30% more capital income than clubs without golf. So just an interesting aspect. And then if we look at some of the attributes of these clubs, it's again probably not surprising, but what you see is, it's generally the larger clubs, pretty intuitive, create higher amounts of capital income. So if you look at full member equivalents, it scales pretty much up the curve. Interestingly, there certainly is a correlation between initiation fee and amount of capital income a club derives. Now, there's not always a correlation between initiation fee and size of club, right? Because there are some very small clubs that are very, exclusive and had very high initiation fees. So one of the things I would, draw your attention to is, there's a chicken and egg thing here a little bit, but generally, if you get into this mode of decreasing your initiation fees because you think that's going to help you, attract more members, that does eventually have an effect on the capital income of the club, obviously, because that's directly going into that capital bucket. So, it helps you on the operational side when you pick up that member and you pick up their operational dues, and that's often the most critical thing that's being worked on. But there is an impact on the capital side. And so, protecting your initiation fee is pretty important, because not only does it flow right into that bucket, but you can see there is a correlation. I'm not going to look at this lower one, but there is a correlation, again, chicken and egg, hard to say, between, capital income and initiation fee and membership turnover. When you have a very low initiation fee, you have, very little skin in the game to keep people in. So something to bear in mind when you're looking at that. When we look at the sources of that capital income, it's what everybody would expect. Initiation fees is the largest piece. We have capital assessments, actually is the second largest piece. Now that can be planned, or that can be kind of an emergency thing, depending on what's happening at the club. Capital dues is the third largest, and then you've got operational deficit and other capital income, which come in as last place. So, in my mind, when you look at which of these slices are predictable and which of them are not highly predictable, initiation fees quite often is not highly predictable, because you don't know how many members you're going to bring in. So the amount that comes in is unpredictable. Capital assessments, well, it's short-term predictable because you're going to have one. But in the long term, it's not something you count on year over year. And certainly an operating surplus is not something you can count on. So in my mind, we're big proponents of capital dues as generators of capital income, because they are completely predictable. Yet it only represents in the industry 22% of capital income for the industry. But when you've got a capital income line that's specifically targeted, members understand this is going towards capital. That has a big impact. That's coming in year over year over year. And so, about 60% of clubs have a capital dues. And, you're not generally talking about a lot of money. You're talking about, $300, $400, $500 a year per member. And it completely changes the trajectory of your capital income. So I don't mean to deep dive too much in capital dues, but while we're on the capital income KPI, I'm a huge proponent of putting predictability into your capital income, because the capital needs are predictable. So your capital income should be predictable as well. And capital dues is a great way to do that. I mean, if you just take graphically a very simple picture, if all you have is initiation fees, obviously you're extremely lumpy, and you can hover up and down around zero in certain years. Where when you have a capital dues, that sets a baseline, and now the lumpiness of an initiation fee is on top of that baseline. So, any clubs that don't have a capital dues but have a $1,000 or $1,200 or $1,400 food and beverage minimum, you have an ideal opportunity to start changing that, perhaps, and say, well, you know what? Rather than driving people in to spend money on something that actually drains cash out of the club, meaning food and beverage, what if we took half of that, minimum, if you will, 600 of the 1,200 food and beverage minimum, and said, let's put instead a $400 capital dues in place per member. Well, now, that trajectory of $400 per member every year, year over year over year, lets you build and maintain the facilities in a way that you don't need the stick of a food and beverage minimum to drive them in the door, right? They're coming in because they want to be in. That's the way you want to get members in. So driving in with a stick versus having those funds flow into something to keep the club relevant, like capital, is a completely different mindset of how you manage the finances of the club, but I think it's an important mindset. Moving on to the next KPI, which frankly is what we call the net available capital, and this is again that post-operations view of capital, right? Did we add capital from operations? Did we subtract it? What is the real amount of capital that is left in that net scenario? And when you look at clubs, it's a little bit different because, as we know, clubs, the net capital is different than the capital income. So what we basically do is we take the operating bottom line of the club. Here it's called net available cash, but think about the operating bottom line. And then we add in your initiation fees, any other capital income or investment income, any capital assessment income, and then we strip out any leasing payments because we do treat that as a capital flow. And that's really the net number that after you've paid for all of your operations and after you've looked at all your other capital flows, not capital investment, but capital, income and lease payment outflows, that's really the pile of cash that you've created that can go back into the club either for debt reduction or for capital investment, whether it's maintenance capital or aspirational capital to build something new. If we look on the non-golf side, again, the numbers are a little different, but not drastically different, pretty darn close. And there is something worth noting here. We'll look at it again in a minute, but this is the zero line, right? This is your net available capital line. So everyone talks about there's 10 or 15% of the clubs in the industry that are really in trouble. That's where these clubs live, in this 10 to 15%, because think about what that actually means. These are clubs that after operations and after all their capital income, they still didn't pay their operational bill, right? They stole all their capital, but they're still below zero on net available capital. That's a pretty tough place to be. And if you don't know you're there, you probably are not going to recover from that. If you know you're there, I think you can recover because you can focus on it, you can understand it. Now, luckily, it is only, 10% of the industry, and probably every industry at any point in time has 10% of the players that are in significant trouble. But, that's a tough place to be. So it's one of the reasons to know what your net available capital is, but it's not the only reason. The next one we're going to get to is the third one. And again, this, I hope you're sort of watching this all from the perspective of this is the kind of information that should be brought to boards and boards should be understanding and discussing, right? How much capital income did we produce? What was our net capital after these other things? And now finally, this new KPI called net available capital ratio. And frankly, what we do is very simple, but I think it's extremely effective. And I think it's ultimately where the rubber hits the road. If someone had to put a gun to my head and said, Russ, after 5 years in this industry, what's the most important number? And I know it's not all about numbers. It's about culture and satisfaction, but we're talking numbers here today. What's the most important number to watch for a club? And I believe it's this ratio we're about to look at. So what this ratio simply is the net available capital that we just looked at divided by the operating revenue of the club. Now that capital doesn't come from operating revenue, but we just use that as a sizing mechanism because obviously if you're a $20 million club, you're going to have higher capital requirements than a $3 million club. So we put that net available capital relative to the size of the club, size meaning revenue. And what we've discovered is that at the median of the industry, clubs produce a net available capital at 11%, equaling 11% of their operating revenue. So if it's a $10 million club and they're right in the median of the industry, their net available capital was 1.1 million. If it's a $20 million club and they were right in the middle of the industry, they're at 2.2 million. Although we'll see in a minute that this does vary a little bit by size of club. So this really is ultimately what defines, are you producing, again, it doesn't say, to know if you're producing enough or not, you really need things like a capital reserve study and a capital plan. But this certainly gives you a relative measure to say, hey, relative to other clubs or relative to what we've done in previous years, what is our net available capital ratio look like? Do we seem to be producing capital that's in scale with the size of our club? And so, if we look at a couple things, if we look at non-golf clubs, actually their capital ratios are a little bit higher, but not drastically. It's pretty darn similar in general when you look at the breakpoints. And you can see there is a correlation between the operating bottom line of the club and the capital you produce, because chances are if you're suffering from an operational deficit, A, we know you're stealing capital, but B, you're probably not even focused on capital. You're probably so focused on patching up that operational deficit that you may not be giving things like capital dues and capital investment the attention that it needs. But the really important piece to look at, and why is it important to understand where you are in this curve, is because it's pretty easy to see that if you're down in this lower quartile, you're pretty much very starved. Now, you may not be in this below the zero line like those 10 or 15% of clubs we talked about a few minutes ago. But if you're here, if you're only producing, for capital, available capital relative to 4% of the club, if you're, a $10 million club, you've generated $400,000 of net available capital. Chances are that's not enough to keep a $10 million club, relevant, just based on maintenance capital, let alone any aspirational things you want to do with it. And clubs in this zone, they tend to be in what I'm calling somewhat starved. Obviously, up and to the right is a good place to be, and we can see there are some clubs that are throwing off a significant amount of net available capital. So very, very important number, because ultimately it says at the end of the day, at the end of the year, I should say, but at the end of the year, did the club produce anything that could be reinvested back into the club, right? Are we growing and building this club, or are we kind of, just holding down the fort and maybe deteriorating a little bit each year because we can't afford to change the drapes or the curtains or to build the outside dining area or whatever it might be? And that's really a relevancy. This is a good relevancy measure for a club. So very, very important. It's one of the most important metrics on the executive dashboard. And again, correlate this to the kind of discussions that happen in the boardroom. If boards start having this discussion around their net available capital ratio and, how do we move up into the right, or at least into a healthy zone, that's a whole different discussion, right? And now you can start to have the discussions like, well, maybe we should convert part of our food and beverage minimum to a capital dues. Maybe we should bump our capital dues, $30 a year per member, whatever it might be. But the point is, you have a measure that you can say, where am I now, and is that where I need to be, or do I want to move to a different place? Okay, I'm going to move along quickly here because we're at 2:30. So there is a difference between sizes of clubs. Very quickly here, if we just look small, medium, large clubs, and small is just less than 5, medium is 5 to 10, larger is greater than 10 million in revenue. There's a couple things we noticed. First of all, we noticed that in general, smaller clubs have lower capital ratios than larger clubs. Now, part of that's because a smaller club has fewer moving parts, right? So you have maybe a smaller clubhouse. So it's not too much of a surprise. But generally the capital ratios are smaller for larger clubs. Again, you could argue, is that mean they're a little bit starved, or does it just mean their needs are less? The other thing is basically everybody in the lower quartile of the industry is in a starved position, right? It doesn't matter what the size of your club. If you're in this 2, 3, 4, 5, 6% range, you're in a capital starved range. So what I would encourage everyone to do, and we're going to start wrapping it up here, but if you're a member, go in and run your executive dashboard reports. We are happy to help you with the interpretation of those. It's not, there are definitions specific in the Word version of it, but we're happy to help you with that interpretation. If you're not a member, there are some sample reports you can look at by just going at clubbenchmarking.com dashboard. And so I hope, the intent of this webinar was to put in perspective this one portion of the executive dashboard report and for non-members, just some ratios that are important for you to start thinking about. Again, putting a club in context of these 15 KPIs is a change in discussion and a change in understanding for boards. So using these kind of things in orientation programs are really, really important. Not to beat the horse bloody, but ultimately this is about identifying and developing industry standard measures so that you can predict your performance. Imagine if you could take your data, whether you're in CB or not, a little bit easier in CB, and actually plug in your budget and look ahead 12 months and say, if we hit our numbers, what is our capital ratio going to be by the end of through the end of this coming fiscal year? That's pretty powerful. And that's what I mean when I say predictive of performance, that by just putting in a little bit of information, you can actually do a what if and say, where are we going to end up on gross margin? Where are we going to end up on our capital, net available capital ratio, et cetera, et cetera. Very powerful. Obviously, talking about, the variation of food cost from last month to this month, relative to the kind of things we're talking about now, that is clearly not predictive of overall performance. It's not predictive of anything. And we feel like we're making headway in getting clubs to stop talking about those things the way they do. But there's a long way to go, and just keep on going. And everyone on this webinar is part of the army to make that happen, because you're here because you're trying to come up with better ways of focusing discussions and decision making within your clubs. So just before we get to a little bit of Q&A, I mean, the need for standardization is clear across, the industry, and what we've come up with is a few that we think are very powerful relative to capital creation. We think capital reserve studies fit right in line with this, and if you haven't done one in a while, it's probably something to start thinking about. If you don't know your status, relative to these kind of KPIs, certainly that ratio, the third one we looked at, you're running a little bit blind, and that's a dangerous thing. It's better, I think ultimately good managers are rewarded for finding things that need fixing, not hiding things that need fixing. So, that's a little bit of my, my ultimate engineering background is you're trying to expose things that need fixing. And I think this is a case where we can use some of these measures to help expose that. So, that's kind of where we are today. What I'm going to do is actually turn it over to Terry. I think she can unmute herself.
I'm here.
And just if we have any questions. So we'll take a few questions, and then we'll let folks get on with their day.
If you have questions, on the right side of your screen, you'll see a toolbar in the chat box there. Any questions you have. I have any recommendations, ideas on how to generate capital?
Well, we talked a little bit about, capital dues. I mean, that to me is the best and simplest way. There are complex ways as well, but that's the best and simplest because, I talked about training your membership, and when they see every month on their statement, or I guess it's maybe if you bill them annually, however you bill them, operational dues, $6,500, capital dues, $500. You're reminding them, first of all, that there is an obligation. They have two things they need to fund in the club, number one. Number two is you've created another line item. So it lets you, as capital needs vary, it lets you, frankly, move that number up, as you grow your club and do great things. It lets you grow that up. And it's putting predictability in. It's creating that baseline of capital income. So to me, that's the best thing I can think of that we've seen. Is just frankly make sure you're using capital dues, and if you've got you don't have it and you have a large food and beverage minimum, I think there's a golden opportunity there because not to call it a bait and switch, but you can make the burden look about the same or a little lower. But the fact that half of that money, let's say, is going towards capital will absolutely change the trajectory of the club.
That's great. Jason asked if we would get a copy, if we're going to email out a copy of this. We definitely will. A link to the recording and possibly the slide deck and some other resources.
The recording. I'll
Here's
just
another
comment on that.
question.
I think the I think the recording part of it is good, especially if you're going to pass it on to board members or something like that. Because if they just see a slide deck, it doesn't without the narrative, not that I'm the greatest orator in the world, but without the narrative, it's they're not getting the interpretation, and I think the interpretation and the nuance of all this is important. So I would encourage people to use the archives for that.
Right. Steve asks, you recommended taking ops margin to capital reserves. How do you recommend handling ops deficits?
Oh, I don't think there's a silver bullet in that. I mean, the reality is when there are operational deficits, it's coming out of your capital flow. So I recognize that completely. So yeah, the key is how do we eliminate the operational deficit? And that gets to other parts of the executive dashboard, the non-capital parts, right? So it's amazing. We can look at the executive dashboard for a club that I don't know anything about, and in about 45 seconds, I don't know the culture of the club or the satisfaction, but financially, you can tell the story precisely. And so if you have an operational deficit, it generally shows up as your gross, typically what you'll see is the gross margin looks low. Well, why is the gross margin low? Well, you look the next ratio down and well, look, the dues ratio, normally we know about 50% of a club's operating revenue is dues. This one's at 45%. Or maybe the payroll ratio is at 62 and we know the median's at 54, 55, and when you get above 60, it's very hard. So I mean, to solve the operational deficit problem, you have to solve the operational deficit problem. To patch it up, yeah, it's coming from capital, right? That's what's going to happen. But that's not what you want to do. You want to ultimately solve that problem, and it might be driving in more members. It might be, I'm a believer of growing to health, not cutting to health, right? But in some cases, you might have to cut expenses if they look out of whack for the finances of the club.
Steve is a customer. Steve, if you haven't done an annual review with us yet this year, I'd recommend doing that. I'll send you an email after the session about how to get that set up, and we can kind of go through and take a closer look with you.
Okay, you got time for one or two more quick ones?
Uh, yes. Are you, as you make the recommendation to remove F&B minimums, is there any tracking of food spend in those clubs that have followed that procedure?
There is, and my partner Ray Cronin has done a couple projects. It's obviously there's a little bit of a sell to that concept, and he's done a couple projects with clubs. So we can connect you with Ray. I don't. There is results, tracking results of that. I just don't know. I don't have them off the top of my head or know what they are. I can tell you from a capital perspective, one club we worked with went from basically 3 years of zero capital income to 3 years of 450,000 a year, which was a big deal to them. They weren't that big of a club, but yeah, as part of that process, and we there is a process that we help clubs with, through this process. We do some analysis of who's spending how much where, the 80-20 rule. So we kind of do some analysis. We spend time on, well, if we were to move these numbers around, have some go to capital dues, what would that be? What would be the impact on the club? And then what members are affected to what degree? So your low F&B use member, what's going to be the impact on them? Net financial. The mid user, the ones that just meet their minimum, the mid users, and then the real heavy spenders in F&B, which we all know that's the 20% people that spend 80% of the money in there, and they're going no matter what. They don't care about their minimum. What's the impact on them? So yeah, I mean, I would encourage you to just contact us, and we're happy to share some of that with you. Or if you want to, dig into maybe that as a project, we're happy to help you with that too.
One more question. Can clubs upload interim financials into the benchmarking system? How can the board look at KPIs monthly rather than just annually?
We don't right now. It is just annual. The platform does support monthly, and we had it actually originally turned on, and we turned it off because people were getting kind of mired in the monthly aspects of it. At some point, we're going to put further granularity in front of it rather than just annual. I'm not sure if that's going to be monthly or quarterly. The challenge is going to be, obviously, when you look at annual, numbers, you sort of take seasonality out of it. And when you put in, and so we've been able to, really analyze it and understand, at an annual basis, what should the value should, from a health perspective of a particular KPI, what range does it seem reasonable to live in? And when you get into a monthly scenario, obviously there's a lot more variability, especially in seasonal clubs. And so we have to feel confident that we're not just giving back numbers, but we're giving good, actionable, usable information. And we don't want to get the boards mired in the monthly stuff. So it's a good question. I don't really have an answer to it fundamentally. What we are about to do is, probably over the next couple weeks, is launch a little section just for budgeting, and we'll see how much detail we're going to go into with it. But at a minimum, the goal is that by entering about 20 or 25 data points, real high level stuff, you can actually, with the click of a button, generate your forward-looking, your budgetary, if you will, executive dashboard report. So kind of like I talked about, imagine if you could, run this for the year ahead. We're going to actually put that in as a capability onto the platform for members. So that's going to be pretty powerful, I think, especially clubs are getting into budget season now. If you could go ahead and actually load all that relatively simply, run a report and say, hey, if we hit our numbers, this is what we're going to look like coming out of the year. And then, of course, at the end of the year, you'll find out. So a little long-winded answer, but I think that will be helpful in terms of looking forward, not so much yet on the monthly piece. All right, I think we're about 45 minutes into it, and as usual, I've run over my half-hour promise a little bit. So I think we'll let it go at that, and keep an eye out for the next webinars. We'll have, if you look at our homepage, we have a link to the next series, the next webinar in the series, and we'll be sending out an email again, and we will hopefully see you all again soon. Thank you.